As is becoming something of a running theme with these videos, Shadowrun Returns was a game I had bought, it was on sale if I remember correctly, that I then proceeded not to play to any real extent and used this channel as a way to make me reckon with my poor purchase decisions. But let me tell you, I was thrilled to have done so because Returns wound up being one of my favorite games that I played on the channel. Developed and published in 2014 by Harebrained Schemes, now a subsidiary of Paradox Interactive, Shadowrun Returns is a turn-based role-playing game that sees the player take up the mantle of their own Shadowrunner. A nice title translating more properly to organized criminal, to track down the killer of an old friend in a futuristic and downtrodden Seattle. Over the course of their investigation, the player finds themselves rubbing elbows with an assortment of unsavory types before the story quickly takes a sordid turn, revealing that they found themselves embroiled in far more than they signed up for. Like a lot of CRPGs developed through the 2010s, Returns was funded through a Kickstarter campaign, with its following success resulting in the release of 2 sequels, Dragonfall and Hong Kong. General opinion on the internet is that those games are where the series really hits its stride, to the point that a fan-made mod converting the first game into Hong Kong's engine has been released. Ironically, learning about that sort of just made me want to make a video about this game even more. Not to rag on the sequels or anything, I literally can, considering I've never played them, but be sure to let me know if you want me to. But hey, we all need someone in our corner, and I love to go to bat for an underdog. To me, what made this game so memorable was its atmosphere. Atmosphere is something of a fickle thing in games. Every game has some sort of tangible atmosphere, sure, but how much said atmosphere is actually leaned into as a creative aspect varies widely depending on the type of game and what it's trying to achieve. Atmosphere is not inherently important or irrelevant in and of itself. What matters most is that it works well with the experience that the game is ultimately trying to deliver to players. And Returns seeks, and undoubtedly succeeds, in delivering a subliminally dim and dreary representation of a high-tech future. Make no mistake, this is a depressing, unsettling, and oftentimes outright dark game. But it isn't that up front. It doesn't beat you over the head with those aspects. Instead, it's shown through the people you talk to, like the Jim Butcher reference that is the unhinged coroner Dresden, the landscapes you explore, and the lengths you often have to go to in order to advance through the story. The streets of Seattle might be well lit with neon signs, but you pass by more than a few barrel fires and creatures of the night. It's very much your classic interpretation of a vaguely dystopian future. You get to see firsthand the corruption that has taken hold of the official institutions and just how low desperate people will go to achieve a tiny piece of happiness in such a bleak reality. When the game tells a joke, it's usually with uncomfortable undertones and unease. No good deed goes unpunished, and the world finds no shortage of ways in which to kick the dog, so to speak, usually out of spite. It doesn't tell you how bad things are, not in the slightest. It shows it to you and then forces you to play through it. One of the nicest places in the game, the Seamstress Union, your main base of operations, has escorts dancing in the back room for Christ's sake, and a safe house underneath it with every illegal vendor you could ever want having set up shop. Half the people you interact with, whether in conversation or combat, are complete monsters, and the other half are likely those being tortured by said monsters. A lot of that great subtext is shown through the characters. Individual motivations and perceptions are frequently deeper than they appear on the surface, and you can usually find that depth even in the more one-dimensional personalities. They aren't just there to be interacted with. They're trying to survive in the hellscape just as much as you are, and that usually means that people are more than they appear. The best example of this, without spoiling anything, is probably Miss Kubota, who runs the Union. Generally kind and genteel on the surface, and certainly one of the few good aligned characters in the game, but one look at how she negotiates, as in, she does as good a job as can be done to instill why she runs a place like the Union. This, unsurprisingly, extends all the way down to your own character. You've got to remember, no matter who you create, you're still a Shadowrunner surviving in the underbelly of the world. Even if you play with entirely noble motivations, the best you can basically come off as is as an incredibly unscrupulous anti-hero who screws over more than a few people, some deserving and some not, to reach the finish line. You're still playing a criminal. Although, considering the state of the world, that might be a pretty noble career. This level of atmosphere is important and so vital to the success of a game like Returns because, in contrast to many other CRPGs, this is a game built to tell a story, not to let the player create their own. And goodness, tell a story it does. It's something of a slow burn, taking some time to get going after its cold open, but it does hit its stride, especially through the game's middle section. I will profess that it kinda, sorta jumps the shark towards the end for the purpose of reaching a resolution. It kinda does away with some of that subtext I've been gushing about for the last several minutes, but I wouldn't say it's done poorly. It just shifts into a gear that you probably won't expect given what the rest of the narrative was like. As always, and this is now becoming something I say ad nauseum, I don't spoil things, so if you want to find out what I'm talking about, you gotta go play the game yourself. Aren't I just so evil? One thing that I will say for certain is that I actually enjoyed the narrative more on my second playthrough for this video. As is often the case with any story cloaked in mystery, it's pretty fun to go back and see all the foreshadowing and hints that you're likely to miss out on a blind run. It really shows how intelligently it was actually written at points. The way you can trace dominoes to seemingly innocuous events and watch the house of cards crumble is far more enjoyable than it likely has any right to be. Within that story, the game is linear to a fault, with the individual instances you travel between almost acting like the chapters of a book, to the point that each loading screen comes with a synopsis of what you're getting yourself into, which, as you might expect, are really only worthwhile because of the established atmosphere. It is pretty wild how effective just a few paragraphs can be when set up properly. And when I say this game is linear, I'm not kidding. There is effectively nothing that you do that significantly changes any noteworthy aspect of the main narrative. You are very much just a cog in the machine, and I can understand how some people might be put off by that. But that the story isn't really changed by what you do doesn't mean the way you navigate it isn't. In fact, that is where most of the expression from your character comes out. Scenarios are littered with situations for your character to make use of their physical prowess, technical know-how, and silver tongue to move forward. This, of course, serves the purpose of making you actually get immersed in and attached to your Shadowrunner. That you play the role of an amateur, decidedly beyond the law detective isn't a choice you get to make, but you sure get to decide how you go about gathering the information. It makes the time you spend filling out the skill tree feel like it means something. And it definitely does, because as you might expect, there is no way that you'll become skilled enough in everything to handle every situation. Sometimes your chosen skills give you the fast pass to wherever you want to go, and other times you've got to do the legwork. Or, you could just settle for punching someone in the face. That option is pretty much always available, come to think of it. Most skills are dual-purposed, meaning if you're skilling your ability to whack people over the head with the nearest blunt object in combat, you'll be able to do so in dialogue. If you're a nerd who lets robots handle your dirty business, then you can use that wimpiness to hack computers and so forth. You get the idea. This, in my opinion, is particularly nice because I've always hated the idea of binary stats. Someone might not be terribly charismatic, but if they're built like Barry Bonds on a well-balanced breakfast and wielding a greatsword, then that should count for something in the scope of a conversation. And it's awesome that that is the case within Returns' systems. Which leads us into the combat that might actually see you putting that well-balanced breakfast to use. If you've played any sort of turn-based tactical strategy game, then what's on display here is likely very familiar to you. Units have a certain amount of time at their disposal on any given turn in order to move, attack, or defend themselves. How your character is skilled grants them unique combat abilities, whether it be the ability to cast spells, summon fiends, or, shoot really good, dude. Before each mission, you put together a group of Shadowrunners to accompany you, allowing you to build a team that complement each other, and furthermore letting you specialize your character without fear of, being unprepared for something. This is basically XCOM, if you've ever played anything from that series. Combat is much more of a puzzle than anything, switching back and forth between forcing you to be proactive and reactive depending on how things are going. And you can tell these systems were inspired by XCOM because none of my characters can hit the broadside of a barn. I kind of wish that there was more to say about it, but there really isn't. Outside of the cyberspace sections, which I'll touch on more shortly, this is pretty typical and suitably unremarkable. But that isn't necessarily a bad thing because combat isn't really the focus here. It's more present because, this wouldn't really be much of an RPG without it, and it is very fitting of the world. People die a lot, and there usually isn't much of a fuss made about it, and in light of that, I don't see much point in making a fuss about how general it is for the most part. The best way I can think of to describe Returns' overall setup is like an inverse Icewind Dale. Icewind Dale has a story for the purpose of driving combat, Returns has combat for the purpose of driving the story. And that's just fine because the rest of the game was built around that. Now, as I am one to rigorously screen my scripts for matters of journalistic integrity, I feel it is prudent that I make light of some parts of the game that may be less than amazing as to project that I am an objective figure, therefore making my praises and analysis that much more believable. First off, as fun as the character generation is, and as awesome as the artwork is, nothing you do here really matters. There are some minute differences between races, mainly in the amount of points that you can put into a single skill tree, which you're never realistically going to reach unless you're specifically dumping one stat, but this entire screen is basically pointless otherwise. For as fleshed out as the skill trees are, there is one teensy tiny problem, which is the fact that charisma is way too good. Yes, it's one-dimensional, being incredibly convincing doesn't help once bullets start flying, but increasing your charisma allows you to learn various etiquette centered around different areas of expertise. Depending on who you're talking to, drawing on the knowledge afforded by those etiquettes will unlock certain unique dialogue options, which basically always resolves the conversation or issue with zero hassle and as beneficially as possible. You'll want some charisma, no matter the type of character you're playing. On the flip side of that, you have decking, which, you know, it's something you can do. Decking greatly increases your abilities within cyberspace. Here's the problem. The cyberspace sections are terrible. They're terrible because they're the one example of where the mix between story and gameplay doesn't work. It's painfully obvious that these sections only exist for the purpose of introducing characters that would otherwise be inaccessible and fleshing out some backstory. That there is any combat in these simulations is simply a waste of time and bears zero weight. It's basically impossible to die in cyberspace unless a very specific type of enemy gets a hold of you. Otherwise, any damage dealt is just superficial. It's basically railroading, for as accurately as that term can be used in this context. And the developers knew this. If your character has no decking ability, it's not like you miss out on anything or have a harder time because of it. They just bring in an NPC to do the hacking for you. Thankfully, the sections are short, not to mention few and far between, but that just lends even more reason as to why putting points into decking isn't the greatest of ideas. It can earn you some cash in the way that it will let you acquire valuable data that you otherwise couldn't, but money isn't an object in this game. You always get a fresh injection whenever you'll need some. Also, you can only save at specific times. It's sort of weird and was apparently a development constraint, but the game autosaves enough that it isn't really much of an issue. I can't run through some of these criticisms, however, without making extremely clear that this is basically nitpicking. Just because one thing might be better than the other doesn't mean that you can't get through the game just fine no matter how you choose to play, which, in and of itself, is a pretty good indicator of a well-made game. I hate nothing more than when games in a series are compared to each other without the context in which they were made. Like I said, I haven't played the following two Shadowrun games, but I would expect, considering the success of Returns, not to mention the passing of time, that they would display more technical polish and in-depth systems. We should expect more out of games as the foundation for which they are built on is crafted, but that doesn't mean there's any reason to think any less of titles in respect to when they were released. No two games, even in the same series, are made within the same circumstances or confines. Maybe the two other games are better, and to some extent we should hope they would be. But if you're looking for a story-driven, gritty, and atmospheric title in a futuristic setting, then Shadowrun Returns is sure as hell a good place to start.